I noticed a couple of weeks ago in the Milbank Quarterly an interesting piece by Fred Zimmerman about epidemiology and about public health research, making the case that it needed to become more politicized, that it needed to become more engaged. Now, the problem of spending too much on basic research and not enough on actual the social and behavioral science of how that research gets translated into action is being displayed for us right now with COVID. As far as we can tell, there was no NIH money spent on the behavioral science of getting people to accept vaccines. Lots of money went into the vaccine. The institute that's responsible for education got no stimulus money, even though one of our biggest questions is it safe or not safe to have kids in school? So we're seeing this neglect of vital issues that are actionable right now playing out. But one of the things that Zimmerman said was that I think also relates to methods and relates to causal inference, indeed, is that public health spends too much time documenting what happens and not enough time trying to study why it happens and how it happens. And in this sense, I think we come to another thing that we've talked a lot about in our book and a lot in our work and a lot in our grant reviews when we used to be giving out money in the public health law research program. And that's the importance of theory as a powerful driver, guide, and element of the kind of quasi-experimental and observational research you're talking about. So maybe you could say a little bit about theory and how that helps you strengthen your work and your impact. Alex, you want to start us off?
Sure, I'm happy to. A lot of policy work is a lot of policy evaluations, a lot of the science around policy. A lot of them are really atheoretical. They're just directly assessing the policy's effects on an important outcome, such as car crashes or firearm deaths or whatever the case might be. And those are useful and important in their own right in kind of understanding the epidemiology of a problem and the prevention of specific problems. But they alone are not sufficient, I think, to really move the field forward. And I think Scott's already intimated why, because understanding how and why a particular effect happens, that is, understanding the underlying mechanisms of effect, then lays the groundwork for applying that intervention, that law, that approach, or that mechanism to a host of new problems, not just the one outcome that's originally studied. So if we're going to understand mechanisms, right, it requires theory. And oftentimes our theories are implicit, but it's much better if they're made explicit. So, in some of my own research, consider the research on laws that are targeted at controlling DWIs, driving while impaired by alcohol. I studied them a lot some years ago, using strong time series design to study each US state that changed their laws on things like mandatory minimum fines, mandatory laws about mandatory minimum jail time, the legally allowable blood alcohol limit while you're driving, and laws on suspending the driver's licenses of offenders. Well, we step back a little bit. What came out of all of that? Well, mandatory fines had kind of a modest effect on the crash rates. Mandatory jail laws had very little consistent effects on the problem. But the laws on suspending the driver's license had consistent and sizable effects. Basically, the small license penalty applied more quickly and more broadly was more effective than the more severe penalties that are applied after some delay. Well, now let's back up to the theory. It's pretty obvious. So just to use a crazy example, what happens when you get a puppy and you need to train them? The key is rewarding them, right? We reward them with a smile, attention, petting them, or even giving them a treat immediately when we see them doing a behavior we desire. You don't give them the reward. You don't give your puppy the reward a week later or even an hour later. This is well-established theory in operant conditioning, right? A reward or punishment shapes behavior to the degree that it is closely associated in time. It's connected in time to the behavior that you want to encourage or deter. Well, 46 different US states across 3 decades of time have run this natural experiment with administrative, that is quick, driver's license suspension. From the traffic safety studies, we know a less severe penalty administered immediately is more effective than a more severe penalty administered later. Well, then we could bring in further theory from social psychology and sociology about norms and modeling and communication networks, etc., to better understand how these laws accomplish their objectives. But finally now, we apply that theory, the broader lessons from a decade or 2 or 3 of research in traffic safety on drunk driving. We apply that to the opioid epidemic or any other problem that you're currently studying. So that's where the theory building is so important. That allows us to expand out and have a huge impact on society, even though we're studying just this arena that may be very important, car crashes, but it has implications for all these other problems as well.
Well, you know, our colleague Evan Anderson and I were recently writing a little review of the COVID response and what the evidence was. And one of the interesting points he made, I thought, was that that kind of basic research, or that kind of research on the mechanisms of legal effect, should be considered sort of our basic research and should get more attention and funding, because when you have a new problem like COVID, you can't do 3 or 4 years of studies to figure out what will be the most effective response. You've got to design a response right away, and the only thing you can base that on in terms of knowledge and evidence is analogous evidence or sort of basic evidence. So it's kind of like, why did we get a vaccine in a year? Because we had been spending lots and lots of money on basic research for the previous, decade or more, on RNA delivery systems and so on. So, I think we have still neglected that kind of research, even though it's quite, it's not just some things like deterrence, as you talk about. Your work in tax has also been really useful. People know that if they have an alcohol tax, it reduces consumption by a sort of predictable amount. And guess what? That same sort of predictable impact happens if you use a cigarette tax, or even if it's turning out if you use a sugar-sweetened beverage tax. So we don't always have to, wait for the evaluation retrospectively if we have this kind of foundational or fundamental research to help us at the start. But Jeff, you're a real test case here, because you're an exquisitely well-trained sociologist with a capacious sociological imagination, working with a bunch of psychiatrists and other people who perhaps have a quite different worldview. How have you been able to, draw upon sociology, and how has that, helped you shape research in the areas that you work in?
Well, sometimes it's fun to be the only sociologist with a bunch of medical people, because you could say something that would be perfectly obvious to every sociologist, and they think that you're a genius. You made that up yourself. Social determinants of health and things like this. So, I appreciate your answer, Alex. I think it's right on. I would think it's probably true that we are a bit impoverished in the theory department, and there's a reason for that, which is that we are deliberately in the business of being applied social scientists. I mean, if I had wanted to go and be an academic sociologist, the purpose of which is to develop theories, even if people don't care about them, then I would have had a different career. I made a deliberate choice to work in an interdisciplinary way in a medical school and psychiatry department, where you're incentivized, at least I am, in the kind of work I'm doing, to answer that question of what works, right? And so if you find something that works, then sometimes we're less interested in drilling down to the question of why and these mechanisms, because we just want to go out and implement that. But ironically, once we get into the implementation, that's where I think sometimes our lack of theory gets us in trouble, because if we had a theory that actually shows how all of these things are connected to each other in some overarching way, maybe that would have told us who's most likely to benefit from this intervention, and who's maybe not likely to benefit from it, and what needs to be in place in a community or a political environment or a workplace environment in order to have this intervention have any chance of getting traction. And I think, but what's challenging again is if let's say you're in injury prevention and you're trying to develop evidence for ways to reduce violent behavior. So, well, what causes violent behavior? I mean, it kind of depends on what level of resolution you're actually looking at this from. So you might be a neuroscientist and you say, well, gosh, this is about the dopamine system. Let's take a group of homicide offenders and compare the cerebrospinal fluid of those who committed their crime impulsively and those who deliberated about it and thought about it and had some malice of forethought. And you find, guess what? There's a greater level of some, of a genetic mutation for an enzyme that's related to some dopamine metabolite. Well, great, that might actually be interesting, and it may have implications for legal questions like culpability and things like that over time. But it's not going to make much sense to people who are looking at it from this different resolution of saying violent behavior is a socially produced and culturally conditioned behavior that has to do, it's a traumatic echo of people's awful childhood that they're reprising in adulthood. And we need to try to get upstream and have healthier communities with fewer kids exposed to trauma. So how do you connect these different levels of theory where you're talking about the neurobiological phenomena of hostility and aggression? So it is kind of it is challenging, but I kind of think what we need, sometimes theory is too big a word for it. We might need some really good causal frameworks where we can actually identify domains of variables and have sort of little mini theories about how things are connected, and then use that. But I mean, we've certainly used theory in some of our research. One little example, we studied this legal tool called a Psychiatric Advanced Directive, which is premised on the idea that people can plan ahead for a period of time when they're going to lose capacity to make decisions, and put in place, their preferences, what are going to happen, and then compare that with a proxy decision maker with healthcare power of attorney. Well, there's a theory, from cognitive psychology that called affective forecasting theory, and what it does is it tells you, and there are experiments with this, that people make all kinds of cognitive errors in trying to forecast what they would want in the future. Often what they think they would want isn't what they actually do want at the end of the day. And people who think it would be just terrible if something happened, when it does happen to them, we adjust to it and we equilibrate. It's not as bad as we thought it was going to be. And so people will say things like, I would never want to live on a ventilator. Well, that's baloney. A lot of people, if the alternative is dying, live on a ventilator for long periods of time and have a pretty good quality of life. So we applied that, in terms of developing our intervention. And it's one reason why it's actually probably better to have a proxy decision maker that you really trust, who knows you very well and can understand these future contingencies that you can't anticipate. So there are ways in which you can apply what we know. But in general, we're rewarded for getting out there and implementing something on a short timeline. And I think we have to kind of fight back about that. I have tried to do that, but I still struggle with it, but I'm glad I had the career I've had, rather than I was criticized in an early job interview because I didn't understand, I couldn't read German. And so I had never been able to read Max Weber in the original German. So I probably misunderstood it. But that turns out not to matter to me now.
Das ist ein Problem.
Okay.
Das ist ein groß, but anyway, I'll give you that. But because you've raised so many other important points, and one thing that always strums my heartstrings is what you talk about. Well, I think of it as transdisciplinarity, the true melding, as you've done in your work, of different theoretical and methodological traditions. Because we all of us, in any standpoint, have a bias. Any method is biased, any theory is incomplete, and it's through the combination that you start to put together a mosaic that captures more of the phenomenon that you're interested in.